August 1944. In a prisoner of war camp in upstate New York, something strange was happening in the mess hall. American soldiers had just served ice cream to a group of newly arrived German women prisoners. Real ice cream, cold and sweet, in flavors the women had not tasted in years. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. The Americans stood waiting, expecting the prisoners to dig in eagerly. Instead, the women sat frozen at their tables, staring at the bowls in front of them with expressions of fear and suspicion. They would not touch the ice cream. They were convinced it was poisoned. They were certain this was some kind of cruel American trick, a final humiliation before execution. And no matter how much the Americans insisted it was safe, the women refused to take a single bite. What happened next would become one of the most memorable moments in the entire history of the camp, a turning point that would change how these women understood their captors and themselves. Before we reveal what finally convinced them to taste that ice cream, and what they discovered when they did, tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. The camp had been established earlier that year to house German prisoners of war captured during the Allied advance through Europe. By August, it held approximately 300 prisoners, including 68 women who had served in various support roles for the German military. The women had been captured in France during the chaotic retreat of German forces. They had been transported across the Atlantic under difficult conditions, spending weeks in cramped ship quarters, uncertain of their fate. During their training and service, the women had been exposed to relentless propaganda about American brutality. They had been told stories designed to make capture seem like a fate worse than death. Americans torture prisoners. Americans starve prisoners. Americans execute prisoners without trial. The propaganda had been so pervasive, so consistent, that it had become truth in the minds of many German soldiers and support personnel. When the women arrived at the New York camp, they had been braced for the worst. They expected to be beaten, starved, perhaps killed. Instead, they had been given medical examinations, clean uniforms, and assigned to dormitory-style barracks that were basic but adequate. They had been fed regular meals. They had been treated with professional courtesy by the American guards. But instead of reassuring them, this decent treatment had made them more suspicious. It must be a trick, many of them reasoned. The Americans are lulling us into a false sense of security before the real cruelty begins. Among the newly arrived women was Helga Schmidt, a 23-year-old from Dresden, who had worked as a communications specialist. She had been raised in a middle-class family, had attended good schools, had been intelligent and curious before the war. But years of Nazi indoctrination had shaped her understanding of the world. She genuinely believed that Americans were capable of unspeakable cruelty, that they viewed Germans as subhuman, that any kindness shown was merely a prelude to worse treatment. Also among the prisoners was Frieda Müller, a 29-year-old nurse from Hamburg, who had treated wounded soldiers at field hospitals. She had seen the worst that war could do to human bodies. She had become hardened and cynical, trusting nothing and no one. When she had been captured, her first thought had been relief that the suffering would end one way or another. Either the Americans would kill her quickly, or she would eventually be returned to Germany. Either way, the war would be over for her. The youngest of the group was Liesel Weber, just 19 years old, from a small village near Munich. She had been conscripted into military service at 18 and had worked in logistics and supply coordination. She was terrified of everything, terrified of the Americans, terrified of what would happen to her, terrified that she would never see her family again. She spent most of her time in the barracks crying quietly, trying not to let the other women see her fear. The day the ice cream arrived had started like any other day in the camp. The women had been assigned to various work details. Some worked in the camp laundry. Others helped in the kitchen preparing meals for the prisoners. Some did clerical work or maintained the grounds. The work was not backbreaking, but it was tedious and gave the women something to focus on besides their fear and uncertainty. Private Michael Chen, one of the American guards, had been assigned to supervise a work detail of about 20 German women prisoners. Chen was a second-generation Chinese-American from California, whose own family had faced discrimination and prejudice. He understood something about being seen as other, about being judged based on appearance rather than character. This understanding had made him more empathetic toward the prisoners than some of his fellow guards. Chen had noticed that the German women were uniformly terrified and suspicious. They followed orders, but maintained emotional distance. They spoke to each other in whispered German but would not engage in conversation with American soldiers. They ate their meals mechanically, as if expecting each meal to be their last. That afternoon, the camp kitchen had received a delivery of ice cream as part of the regular supply shipment. Ice cream was still somewhat scarce due to wartime rationing, but military facilities were beginning to receive it more regularly as supply chains improved. The camp commander, Colonel James Whitfield, had decided that the prisoners should receive ice cream, along with the American soldiers and staff. It was an opportunity to show that prisoners would be treated fairly, that they would receive the same quality of food as their captors. When the ice cream was served in the mess hall that evening, the reaction from the German women prisoners was immediate and shocking. They stared at the bowls of ice cream as if they contained poison or explosives. No one picked up a spoon. No one made any move to eat. The women sat rigidly at their tables, eyes fixed on the dessert in front of them, fear evident on every face. Private Chen, who was supervising the mess hall that evening, noticed the problem immediately. He approached the table where Helga was sitting. "Is something wrong with the food?" he asked in his limited German. Helga looked up at him with an expression that mixed terror and defiance. "What is this?" she asked. "What have you put in it?" Chen was confused. "It is ice cream," he said, "a dessert. It is sweet and cold. It is a treat." "Why are you giving us this?" Helga demanded. "What do you want from us?" Chen suddenly understood. The women thought the ice cream was poisoned or drugged. They thought this was some kind of trap. "Nothing is wrong with it," he said firmly. "It is just ice cream. The same ice cream we are eating." He gestured to tables where American soldiers were happily consuming their own servings. Helga shook her head. "It must be different. You are trying to trick us. You want to drug us or poison us before you kill us." Chen felt a wave of frustration mixed with sadness. These women had been so thoroughly brainwashed by Nazi propaganda that they could not even accept a simple dessert without assuming malicious intent. He made a decision. He walked over to the serving area, got himself a bowl of ice cream from the same container that had been used to serve the prisoners, and returned to Helga's table. He sat down across from her and took a large spoonful, eating it deliberately while maintaining eye contact. "See," he said, "the same ice cream. Nothing wrong with it." The women at the table watched him but remained unconvinced. "Perhaps the Americans have built up immunity to whatever poison is in the ice cream," Frida suggested. "Perhaps they have been given an antidote." Chen was beginning to realize that no amount of verbal explanation would convince these women. He had an idea. He stood up and walked over to the table where Colonel Whitfield was eating with other officers. He explained the situation quietly. The colonel listened, nodded, and then did something that surprised even Chen. Colonel Whitfield stood and addressed the entire mess hall, speaking loudly enough that everyone, including the German prisoners, could hear. He announced that he had been informed that some of the German prisoners were concerned about the ice cream. He wanted to address those concerns directly. He explained that the ice cream came from the same supplier that provided ice cream to American military personnel throughout the Northeast, that it was the exact same product that American soldiers were eating, that there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. Then he did something even more surprising. He invited any prisoner who was still suspicious to watch as he personally ate ice cream from the same container that had been used to serve them. He walked to the serving area, got a fresh bowl, and ate it slowly while standing at the front of the mess hall. When he finished, he set down the empty bowl and said simply, "It is just ice cream. You do not have to eat it if you do not want to, but I promise you, it is safe." Still, the women did not move. They sat at their tables, the ice cream slowly beginning to melt in the warm mess hall, and they did not touch it. The standoff continued for another 10 minutes. American soldiers and officers eating their ice cream and enjoying it, German prisoners staring at theirs and refusing to take a single bite. It was Liesel, the youngest prisoner, who finally broke the deadlock. She was sitting next to an older woman named Martha, who had been trying to comfort her throughout their captivity. Martha had whispered to Liesel, "If they wanted to kill us, they would have done it already. They would not waste ice cream on us first. Maybe we should just accept that this is what it appears to be. A dessert, a small kindness." Liesel, who was tired and scared and sick of being afraid all the time, had made a decision. "If I'm going to die," she announced to the table, "then at least I will die having tasted ice cream one more time." And she picked up her spoon and took a bite. The entire mess hall seemed to hold its breath. Every eye was on Liesel as she put the spoon in her mouth. Her eyes widened. She took another bite, then another, and then, to everyone's surprise, she began to cry. Not tears of pain or fear, tears of something else entirely. The taste of the ice cream, sweet and cold and creamy, had transported her instantly back to her childhood, before the war, before the propaganda, before the fear and the violence and the loss. She remembered summer days in her village. She remembered her mother taking her to get ice cream at the local shop. She remembered what it felt like to be a child who believed the world was good and safe and full of simple pleasures. And she realized in that moment that the Americans were not trying to kill her. They were trying to give her something that had been taken from her by the war. They were trying to give her a moment of normalcy, of childhood innocence, of simple joy. She cried because the ice cream was delicious and because she had been so wrong about her captors, and because she had wasted so much energy being afraid of people who were actually trying to treat her decently. The other women watched Liesel's reaction. They saw her crying. They saw her eating. They waited to see if she would collapse or show signs of poisoning. But she just kept eating, tears streaming down her face, consuming the ice cream as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Slowly, hesitantly, other women began to pick up their spoons. Helga was next. She took a tiny bite, barely enough to taste. Nothing happened. She took a larger bite. The flavor exploded in her mouth. Vanilla. Real vanilla. Sweet and rich and cold. She had not tasted anything like it in over 2 years. Rationing in Germany had been so severe that desserts and sweets had become almost non-existent. And here was this American ice cream, this simple frozen dessert that represented abundance and normalcy, and a world where people had enough of everything that they could afford to give ice cream to their prisoners. One by one, the women began to eat. Some ate quickly, as if afraid the ice cream would be taken away. Others ate slowly, savoring every spoonful. Many of them cried as they ate, though they could not have explained exactly why. It was not just the taste of the ice cream. It was what the ice cream represented. It was the realization that everything they had been told about Americans was false, that the propaganda had been lies designed to make them fight harder, to make surrender unthinkable, to keep them loyal to a regime that had used them and discarded them. Frida, the cynical nurse who had trusted nothing, found herself weeping into her ice cream. She had seen so much suffering. She had believed that suffering was all that war had to offer. But this ice cream, this simple gesture of giving prisoners the same dessert that the guards ate, suggested that there was still kindness in the world, that not everyone was cruel, that it was possible to be enemies and still treat each other with basic human decency. Private Chen watched the women eating and felt his own eyes getting misty. He had not expected such an emotional reaction. He had thought they would just eat the ice cream and that would be the end of it. But what he was witnessing was something more profound. He was watching women who had been dehumanized by propaganda, beginning to reclaim their humanity. He was watching walls of fear and suspicion begin to crumble. He was watching the beginning of healing. Colonel Whitfield, observing from across the room, understood what he was seeing as well. He had been in the military long enough to know that treating prisoners well was not just morally correct, but strategically smart. Prisoners who were treated with dignity were more likely to cooperate, less likely to cause problems, more likely to return to their home countries with positive views of America that could contribute to post-war reconciliation. But beyond strategy, beyond practicality, there was something else. These were human beings who had suffered. If a bowl of ice cream could give them a moment of comfort, then serving them ice cream was the right thing to do, regardless of any strategic considerations. That night in the barracks, the women talked about the ice cream in hushed, wondering tones. They compared notes about the flavors they had tried. They talked about their childhoods, about times before the war when ice cream had been a normal part of summer. They talked about how they had been wrong to be so suspicious, how the Americans had been patient with them, how no one had forced them to eat or mocked them for their fear. Helga lay in her bunk and thought about the moment when Private Chen had sat across from her and eaten his own ice cream to prove it was safe. She thought about how he had not been angry at her suspicion, had not punished her for essentially accusing him of trying to poison her. He had just calmly demonstrated that she was wrong. She began to wonder what else she had been wrong about. If the propaganda about poisoned ice cream was false, what other propaganda was false? If Americans were capable of such patience and kindness, what did that mean about everything she had been taught? Liesel, the young woman who had been the first to taste the ice cream, felt something shift inside her. The fear that had been her constant companion since her capture began to loosen its grip. She was not safe exactly. She was still a prisoner in a foreign country. But she was beginning to understand that her captors were not the monsters she had expected. They were just people. Some kind, some less so, but fundamentally human and capable of decent behavior. Over the following days and weeks, the ice cream incident became a turning point in the camp. The women began to relax slightly around the American guards. Conversations became more frequent. Questions were asked and answered. The women began to participate more actively in English language classes that were offered. They began to ask about America, about its culture and values and beliefs. Private Chen became something of a mentor to several of the women, including Helga. She would seek him out during work details and ask him questions about his life, his family, his experiences. He told her about growing up in California, about the discrimination his family had faced, about joining the army to prove his loyalty to America despite being treated as a perpetual foreigner. Helga was surprised to learn that Americans could face prejudice and discrimination within their own country. It complicated her understanding of America as a monolithic entity. Americans were not all the same, she realized. They had their own divisions and conflicts and struggles. The women began to write letters home to Germany, censored by military authorities but still able to convey general information. Several women wrote about the ice cream incident. They wrote carefully, knowing their letters would be read by censors, but they tried to convey the truth of their experience. "We are being treated well," Frida wrote to her mother. "Better than we expected. Better than we were told to expect. They give us the same food they eat. Yesterday they gave us ice cream, real ice cream. It was the first time I had tasted anything sweet in 2 years. I cried when I ate it. Not from sadness, but from the realization that we have been lied to about so many things." The ice cream continued to be served regularly in the camp, and it continued to have an impact on the prisoners. Each time they ate it, it reinforced the lesson of that first shocking evening, that Americans were capable of generosity, that small kindnesses mattered, that the world could still contain moments of sweetness, even in the midst of war and captivity. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, and preparations began for repatriating the prisoners, many of the women expressed mixed feelings about returning to Germany. They wanted to be reunited with their families, of course. They wanted to go home. But they had also experienced something unexpected in American captivity. They had been shown a different way of treating enemies. They had learned that generosity and dignity were possible even in wartime. Helga, preparing for her journey back to Germany, approached Private Chen to thank him and say goodbye. She told him that she would never forget the evening with the ice cream, how he had patiently proven to her that it was safe, how her own fear and suspicion had nearly prevented her from accepting a simple kindness. "I learned something important that night," she told him. "I learned that I had been taught to see enemies where there were just people. I learned that my own fear could blind me to kindness. I learned that it is possible to be wrong about fundamental things, and that changing your mind is not weakness but wisdom." Chen had told her that he hoped she would carry those lessons back to Germany, that she would help build a better future by teaching others what she had learned. She had promised to try. Years later, When historians and journalists interviewed former prisoners from the camp, many of them mentioned the ice cream incident as a pivotal moment. "It was such a small thing," Liesel would say in interviews, "just a bowl of ice cream. But it changed everything. It was the moment when we stopped being terrified prisoners waiting for torture and execution and started being people who could imagine a future. It was the moment when we realized that kindness was possible, that Americans were capable of treating us with dignity, that the propaganda had been lies." The story of the German women prisoners who refused ice cream until they were convinced it was not poisoned became a case study in military academies and psychology courses. It illustrated the power of propaganda to shape beliefs and the difficulty of overcoming those beliefs even in the face of contradictory evidence. It demonstrated the patience required to deal with people who had been thoroughly indoctrinated. And it showed the transformative power of simple acts of kindness, of treating people with dignity, even when they expect cruelty. But perhaps most importantly, the ice cream incident demonstrated a fundamental truth about human nature. That beneath the uniforms and the flags and the political ideologies, people are capable of recognizing kindness when they see it. That even those who have been trained to hate can learn to see their enemies as human beings. That food, something as simple and universal as ice cream, can become a bridge between enemies, a shared experience that transcends the artificial divisions created by war. The women who sat at those tables in August 1944, terrified to eat ice cream because they were convinced it was poisoned, learned something that changed their understanding of the world. They learned that their fear, while understandable, was misplaced. That their enemies were capable of surprising generosity. That a bowl of ice cream was sometimes just a bowl of ice cream, a simple gesture of humanity from one person to another, unencumbered by politics or strategy, or anything other than the basic recognition that everyone, even prisoners, deserves small moments of sweetness in their lives. That is the legacy of the ice cream that German prisoners initially refused to eat. Not just a story about suspicious prisoners and patient captors, but a testament to the power of simple kindness to break through walls of propaganda and fear. A reminder that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the smallest gestures, and proof that it is never too late to change your mind, to let go of fear, to accept the possibility that the world might contain more kindness than you have been taught to expect. All it takes is the courage to take that first bite.